This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa, and it's Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. There are a lot of different creature stat lines in Magic, and I've already looked at many of them in this series, but there's still a whole lot to go. Because today is February the 4th, I thought it would be a good time to take a look at 2/4s. 2/4 is, obviously enough, a more defensive stat line, and most creatures who have it aren't exactly about turning sideways and doing as much damage as possible to your opponent. Instead, they usually come with some sort of value ability, which is pretty nice since a 2/4 can block a significant percent of creatures pretty effectively. It probably goes without saying, but to be eligible for this list, a creature had to have a power of 2 and a toughness of 4. That meant 257 cards were eligible for this list, and in this video we'll talk about the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. These include top 8s at events like Pro Tours and Mythic Championships, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes top 8s at events like Magic Fests and Magic Online Challenges. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it's SPIRE Golem. It's one of the more aggressive creatures on this list. Because it has an affinity for islands, it can pretty easily be a turn 3 2/4 flyer, which can attack pretty well in the sky, and as the game goes on, it becomes even cheaper. It's gained all of its points in Pauper, where it's primarily been played in aggro decks like Fairies and Delver, and it's going to continue to accumulate points in Pauper going forward. At number 9, it is Duplicant. It has the same score as SPIRE Golem, but more Pro Tour top 8s, so it gets the higher spot on the list. This won't be a 2/4 very often, because when it enters the battlefield, it lets you exile a creature and it gains the stats of that creature. That's pretty powerful, because it makes Duplicant into a removal spell that also adds to the board, and sometimes pretty significantly. One nice thing is that if your opponent sacrifices or bounces the thing you target, it does still come into play with some stats, albeit as a 6 mana 2/4. Anyway, it was played in half the decks to top 8 the Mirrodin Block Pro Tour, appearing in Big Red and 12 post decks, both of which could potentially ramp out the Duplicant early. It also gained a single point in an extended sneak attack deck, where it fits nicely because it coming down and attacking only a single time still means it gets to get rid of an opposing creature. That is one thing to keep in mind with this card. Unlike a lot of effects like it, your opponent never gets their creature back. It has also gained points in Legacy and Vintage Mud decks, which are artifact-based ramp decks, so they can also power out Duplicant quickly, which is pretty nice. It's still gaining some points in Vintage, though it isn't doing it at an especially rapid pace. At number 8, it is AURIOK Salvagers. This 2/4 comes with an activated ability that lets you return an artifact with a mana value of 1 or less to your hand. It didn't gain any points in Block or Standard, but this ability has proven to be pretty great for combo decks in the Eternal formats. In Legacy, it can be combined with Lion's Eye Diamond to produce as much mana as you want, and in Vintage, it can do the same thing with Black Lotus. Because these artifacts cost 0 mana and produce 3 mana, you can just keep getting them back over and over again and netting 1 mana every time. The decks built around the Salvager are often called Bomberman, because the plan is ultimately to use all that mana to constantly recur Pyrite Spellbomb and use its ability until the opponent is dead. These combo decks are quite potent as they quickly mill their entire library and go off. Salvagers is going to continue to gain points in the Eternal formats. At number 7, it is Dryad of the Elysian Grove. This 2/4 is great for ramp decks because it lets you play an additional land each turn, and it also makes it so all of your lands have every basic land type, which means they can produce mana of any color. Unsurprisingly, all of its points have come in ramp decks. In Standard, it was played in some versions of Omnath Ramp. It was a nice fit there because it made it easier to cast the 4-colored Omnath, and because it let you trigger landfall more. It has had the most success, though, in Modern, where it's utilized in both Valakut and Amulet Titan decks. With the Valakut decks, it's great that you can play more lands so that you can get closer to casting Scapeshift, and because the Dryad makes all of your lands mountains, it makes it a lot easier to pull off the win with Valakut. Amulet Titan decks like the Dryad because they like to use Amulet of Vigor alongside the Ravnica bounce lands. With the Amulet in play, the bounce lands untap before returning to your hand, which means you can tap them for mana, and the Dryad lets you play 2 of them in a single turn, which gives you a total of 4 mana, which is pretty awesome. It also has a single point from a Legacy Maverick deck. It's going to continue gaining points, especially in Modern, and it could potentially move higher on this list. At number 6, it is Palace Sentinels. When this 2/4 enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. Being the Monarch is a pretty sweet thing because it means you get to draw a card at the beginning of your end step. This effectively means that this is a 4 mana 2/4 that draws you a card when it enters the battlefield, and it can frequently draw you even more cards than that. Of course, the downside is that your opponent can also take the title away from you if they do combat damage to you, but a 2/4 does a pretty good job of keeping that from happening, especially in Pauper, which is where Palace Sentinels has gained all of its points. It's pretty darn close to being a staple in the format, appearing in a whole lot of white decks including Boros Tokens, Metalcraft, Azorius Ephemerate, and Orzhov Pestilence. It's pretty heavily played in Pauper, and that's going to continue. Before we get to the top half of this list, I do want to take some time to tell you about this video's special sponsor, Into the AM. They've been sponsoring a few videos a month for the last several months, and I've really appreciated it. February the 4th is Into the AM's anniversary, so they're having a site-wide sale with everything 25% off, and that sale runs until February 6th. You should check the sale out because they have a whole bunch of great products, including graphic tees like the one I'm wearing now. This is called Panther Prowl, and it features some pretty striking line art of a panther, well, prowling. You can find this graphic tee and a whole lot more at their store. If you use my referral link, which you can find in the description, you'll get an additional 10% off your entire purchase. Alright, let's get back to the list. At number 5, it is WILDFIRE Emissary. This 2/4 comes with protection from white, and it can also raise its power for 1 generic and a red. It was originally printed in Mirage, and it was played in 4 of the top 8 decks at the Mirage Block Pro Tour, all of which were aggro decks. The stat line here certainly doesn't look aggressive to us today, but against opponents who are playing white, the Emissary was really hard to deal with, and it could actually hit pretty hard when it needed to. It also gained some points in Standard in both aggro and control decks. It's gained several points in Extended as well, all in 1997, where it was a sideboard card in some control decks. The Emissary then went quiet for a pretty long time, until it got a time-shifted reprint in Time Spiral. It gained another top 8 in that standard format in a Boros aggro deck, and it has a single legacy top 8 from 2005 that came in that format's version of Red Deck Wins. The Emissary has a pretty impressive multi-format resume, but it hasn't gained any points since 2007, and even a standard legal reprint wouldn't result in it finding a ton of success. Creatures these days just tend to be so much more powerful. At number 4, it is Grey Merchant of Asphodel, a 2/4 who drains the opposing player an amount equal to your devotion to black. Even on an empty board, this means he drains 2 life, but most of the time when you play the Grey Merchant, he has a far bigger impact on the board than that. Devotion to black decks were a big force in Standard, and the Grey Merchant was a huge part of that. Some versions of Devotion to Black also ran Whip of Erebos, which was particularly nasty with the Merchant because it could allow you to get that Enter the Battlefield ability a second time, and most opponents have no hope of ever coming back from that. The Merchant is also really the key card in Pauper Devotion to Black decks, and it'll continue gaining points in Pauper going forward. At number 2, it is Meloku, the Clouded Mirror. Meloku and the Grey Merchant have the same number of points, but Meloku has more first-tier top 8s, so I gave it the edge. This 2/4 comes with flying and a powerful ability. You can pay 1 and return a land to your hand to make a 1/1 flying token. This means Meloku can very quickly assemble an aerial army, and it also means that spot removal against Meloku doesn't do a whole lot provided the player has at least some untapped mana. Meloku's power meant that 7 of the top 8 decks at the Kamigawa Block Pro Tour ran this powerful Moonfolk. In Standard and Extended, Meloku was also heavily played, primarily appearing as a control deck win condition, including in 4 of the top 8 decks at Worlds in 2005. Meloku even has a single point in Modern, which came in a Scapeshift deck way back in 2012. Meloku was a really important card in Magic for several years, but it hasn't gained any points since 2012, and it's likely to be surpassed in the near future, especially because Grey Merchant has the same number of points. At number 2, it is Torbrand, Thane of Redfell. In the introduction to this video, I said most 2/4s aren't really about doing a whole bunch of damage in a hurry, but Torbrand is an exception to that. This 2/4 loves mono-red aggro decks. It has triple red in its cost, and, more importantly, it makes all of your red sources do 2 additional damage. This includes damage to both creatures and players. This means that on his own, Torbrand is effectively a 4/4, but the board is also usually populated with a bunch of other red creatures when he comes down. This allows him to have a very immediate impact on the board, since suddenly all of your creatures attack a lot harder. Red Deck Wins was a great deck while he was in Standard, in large part because of Torbrand, leading to the deck having a whole lot of top 8s. While he has now rotated out of the format, Red Deck Wins is still a thing in Pioneer, and he's gaining points there. While he doesn't have any points in other formats yet, he has been played in Historic, Modern, and even Legacy, so it isn't even completely out of the question that it will add to its score in the future. Still, even with its impressive resume, Torbran has basically no hope of ever catching up to the number 1 card on this list, which is Courser of KRUPHIX. This 2/4 is a pretty amazing value engine. Being able to play lands off the top of your library is a pretty big deal, as every time you're able to do that, you're effectively drawing a card. Because you can play lands off the top of your library, this helps you get closer to drawing non-lands, while also adding to your resources in play, and that's just great. It doesn't hurt that it also gains you life every time you play a land. Gaining life all game long is pretty effective, especially against more aggressive decks who struggle to attack through the Courser in the first place. The Courser was heavily played in both block and standard, formats where it was effectively a staple, appearing in just about every green deck there was. However, the Courser has proven itself outside of those formats too. It's gained points in Modern, where it has gained the most points in Jund and Valakut decks. It's the most active in Pioneer these days though, having gained points in the past in Sultai Delirium and Omnath Ramp, and more recently Devotion to Green and Collected Company decks. It is going to gain more points, and it already has a massive lead over every other 2/4 in the game, so it's hard to imagine the Courser ever losing its spot at the top of this list. Well, those are the 2/4 creatures that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description, where you'll find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of MTG Top 10, you should subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including a lot more that look at creature stat lines, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.